The incredible success of a little gem called Hades has propelled Supergiant Games into the indie game spotlight. What was once a relatively niche studio has become one of the biggest names in the indie scene. But the success of Hades didn't just come out of nowhere. They've got a back catalogue of a few other games. Now, it's not many games, they've only made 4 games in total, including Hades. But having a small back catalogue of games means that you can really see the growth of the studio from one game to the next, and how they've changed and improved as a studio over time. So I decided to play every single game they've ever made. All 4 of them, I guess. And I only gave myself a week to do it. Their first game in their back catalogue came out more than a decade ago, and it's their first project as a studio, which means they're trying to make a fantastic game with a less than fantastic budget. So let's see how it holds up. If you're already a fan of Supergiant's other work, then you'll feel right at home here. The hallmarks of their style were cemented right here, right away on day one. The isometric camera angle found in every other game they've ever made is still here. They've also cemented their visual identity too. Every game has a different art style to make them all feel, visually distinct and stuff, but they're all made in this beautiful hand-drawn style aesthetic. Even the combat style they've used can be very directly connected to future titles that they'll make. Other than this one, actually, but we'll get to that later. This consistency across all of their titles is actually a very impressive thing to behold, especially for a brand new studio such as this one. Supergiant was formed in 2009 by 2 former EA employees, Amir Rao and Gavin Simon. They left EA to form this studio and started making games with a small team that they'd compiled. This team consisted pretty much exclusively of longtime friends of Amir and Gavin. So to have this team immediately start making games with such a distinct style and feel is incredibly impressive, and even as their team size grew bigger and their budget grew with it, they still knew that keeping that isometric feel with these beautiful aesthetics was the best way to keep themselves standing out from the crowd, and it clearly paid off. Bastion tells the story of a boy who's found himself alone in some strange collapsing world. You have to go around collecting these cores and crystals to beef up your hub world and progress the story. And the entire game is narrated over by one single voice. A voice that at first is nameless, but then turns out to be a character that you meet in the main hub area.
There's a bit of the Bastion's power in that crest.
That hub area being the Bastion. This narrator thing is actually really, really clever, because not only is it a super unique way to tell the game's story, but it also helps with that whole budget thing that we talked about earlier. They don't have to pay a bunch of voice actors to voice every single character, because there's not even that many named characters in the game, but paying voice actors for each one of them would still be expensive. Doing this whole narrator thing means that they only need to pay one guy, and that guy can voice the entire game. And this is a huge part of what makes this game feel unlike other games, because the gameplay actually, in my opinion at least, is the least exciting part of the whole game. The combat is decent, but it doesn't feel nearly as polished or fluid as games that the studio would make in the future. The enemy design is okay, but it's incredibly repetitive. Every new variant of enemy that you encounter looks completely different, but secretly behind the scenes they function in a similar way to an enemy you've already encountered. And there's lots of different levels, but realistically there's only 3 or 4 actual distinct visual locations. There's this medieval city aesthetic, there's a wild jungle aesthetic, and then there's this sort of frozen cathedral vibe. But most of the areas are visually heavily based on one of these 3 aesthetics, and there's not really anything else there. And the enemies inside of those regions stay relatively similar most of the time. What makes the game worth playing is the artwork and the cool storytelling devices and the things the game does that make it stand out from the crowd. But the moment-to-moment gameplay stuff can feel a lot less exciting. The game has a loadout system, right, where you can choose from 2 weapons and then a special attack. But as you progress through the game introduces you to new weapons that you can use. But the game automatically replaces one of your weapons in your loadout with the new weapon that you just found. So you go to the Bastion and you choose a loadout that you thought might be fun, then you go into a level and the game pretty much immediately eats one of your loadout slots with a new weapon. And it doesn't give you the choice to choose which slot it goes into, it just does it on its own. And some of the new weapons are really, really bad, and even the more powerful ones can just not synergize well with the other weapon that you have. And you don't get a choice of what weapon in your loadout gets replaced, so it just ruins your build. And not every single weapon feels particularly fun to use, regardless of whether they're powerful or not. Most of them feel good to use, but there's the odd weapon or 2 in there that felt clunky and underpowered. A handful of the weapons lock you into these slow and restrictive animations when whenever you use them. Some of them literally force you to stand still. So just eating your loadout slots with new weapons against your will in a game that has a bunch of cool weapons and loadout functionality seems like an odd decision to me. This could have been solved by just having like a little pop-up appear that lets you decide which slot to put the new gun in, instead of it being random. Or just letting you pick up the new weapon but not actually use it at that stage at all. Also, the variety in enemies is relatively low, and most new enemies you encounter may as well just be reskins of other enemies with a small added ability to make them more difficult. Like, take a look at these turrets. They stay stationary at certain points and they shoot at you, and they have a bunch of different variants that make them attack slightly differently with different projectiles or whatever. And another one of the enemies that appears later in the game is these flowers. These flowers are pretty much identical to the turrets from before. They just look slightly different. They do have another ability though. Like, the flowers will hide from you for a period of time after you damage them, so that you have to kill them with bursts of damage to be able to kill them quickly. But other than that tiny difference, they're basically just reskins of enemies that you've already seen. And the enemy variants that did seem interesting in me, like these big scumbag things, they completely stopped being used with no reskin like halfway through the game. It was very unusual. And the cause of all this is incredibly obvious, right? It's those pesky budget constraints that we talked about. A brand new studio is making a relatively ambitious game, so they have to be very clever and creative with their enemy and level designs to make sure that they can actually make a game without going bankrupt over it. And they only have a limited amount of time and manpower to fine-tune the combat system to being as fluid as it is in their later titles. The game's main selling point, to me at least, is the fact that it's very creative. It has cool music and cool visuals and a cool narrator that tells the story in a way that I've never seen another game do. There's even this really cool moment where you come back from a mission and there's this pipe sat here, and when you take a puff of the Zaza, you go into some strange dream world where the narrator tells you the story of what happened to the kid before the events of the game. In terms of gameplay, it's not that interesting. It's just a bunch of waves of enemies in this one single room. But it's a unique way to get the story across, and it feels like something you've not really seen before. If you're interested in playing Bastion, play it for the flavor. The world building itself at your feet as you run across it. The game narrating your every move. The voice of Ashley Barrett making the game literally 2 letter grades better instantaneously at the click of your fingers. Another thing that Bastion does that's pretty cool, that all of Supergiant's other titles also do, is these little difficulty modifiers. In Bastion, they're called idols, but in other games they have different names. The Pacts of Punishment, the Titan Stars, whatever they want to call it. They essentially act as difficulty modifiers, so that if you wanted to give the game an added challenge, you can do that, and usually you get a reward for doing so. Maybe it makes the enemies have more armor, or deal more damage, or have more attack speed or whatever. But if you turn this difficulty modifier on, you get extra money and XP to spend on leveling up. This is quite a cool mechanic, because I did personally find Bastion to be relatively easy. There's only 2 difficulty options in the starting menu. There's normal, and then there's the easier option. I played on normal difficulty and found that the game wasn't a challenge at all. You're given health potions literally all the time, and even if you do die, you can actually revive a few times before you get a game over on a level, similar to how the revive system in Hades works. So I never once actually got a game over screen. The most I ever died was twice in a level, and the only reason I died twice was because the game gave me these revolvers and it ate my most powerful loadout slot and replaced it with these 2 piles of garbage. So having these idols to enhance the difficulty is actually a really good thing, because there's nothing wrong with a game not being hard. Not every game has to be Dark Souls 11 the movie Prepared to Die edition, but giving the added difficulty modifier to those who might want it is a great idea, because difficulty settings like these are generally terrible, at least in my opinion anyway, because before you've seen a single second of gameplay, you're being asked what difficulty to play on, and these difficulties can vary wildly. Like, when you pick the hardest difficulty in a game, you never know what you're gonna get. Are you gonna get Halo 2's Legendary mode, or are we more talking Kirby's Epic Yarn Devilish mode? You just never know what you're gonna get, because these 2 things just aren't the same. So instead of relying on a difficulty setting like this, using in-game explanation difficulty settings is actually a great idea. The last thing of note I want to bring up is this ending sequence. There's a sequence where you get this new weapon. It's just a massive battering ram thing that you swing around that does tons of damage and can destroy some terrain. This weapon's pretty cool. It makes you insanely slow, but using it in combat is like relatively fun. But then there's this part at the end where you go through a horde of enemies with this battering ram, and the game makes you invincible and lets you just walk through them and pummel every enemy in the face for free. I think it's supposed to be this sort of like power trip moment at the end of the game, but it really doesn't do a good job at feeling like that. It feels incredibly artificial because your health bar literally disappears off screen and you cannot take damage, so it just loses all concept consequence. Moments like these happen in video games all the time, and they can be really exciting, but the power trip needs to feel at least slightly earned for it to have a good payoff. Like at the end of Half-Life 2 when your gravity gun corrupts and turns blue. You can still die, you're not immortal now that you have this weapon, you're just much more powerful. But the game ramps up the difficulty to match your newfound power level. It increases the number of enemies and makes the areas you have to fight in more open and harder to hide in. The game is giving you a power trip, but it's still trying to challenge you, so that even though you have a crazy powerful weapon, you still felt like you had to actually earn your victory against whatever enemies you were fighting. Another fantastic example of this is in Katana Zero. There's this one mission where you get to play as a different character, a guy who basically has much more powerful versions of your abilities. This character can completely decimate enemies in an instant, but the level is still difficult. It's not a walk in the park just because you can warp across the screen and delete enemies. They spawn 3 times the number of enemies, and they make the level layouts more tricky, and the enemy variants are tougher than the average ones. So being more powerful doesn't just let you breeze through the game instantly, you still have to actually think about your approach, despite being a powerhouse in this one level. So if you want to make this sort of cathartic power trip moment work, you can't just remove 100% of the challenge, you still need to make the victory actually feel earned. But Bastion's final power trip moment really doesn't do that at all. You are literally invulnerable, and you can just walk up and one-shot every enemy when they can't even fight back. And it also doesn't help that you're like really slow too. Like maybe if you could suddenly move really fast with this thing or whatever, it would be harder to tell that you are literally immortal and can't die. Now there's also an alternate scene to this, because right before this you're given a choice to either save the bad guy or leave him. I chose to leave him, which is what gave me this battering ram invulnerability scene. But if I had taken him with me, this moment gets even weirder. You're still invincible and the enemies just shoot the crap out of you, but you don't fight back. And halfway through this walk, they just like stop shooting you randomly. It's very odd actually. I guess the point is that the enemies are realizing you're being selfless and they like don't shoot you for it or something. But this guy's clearly dead. Like look at how much you're being lit up by every enemy around you. You're clearly dead. These ending sequences are just a little bit weird to me. I see what they were going for, I think, but it doesn't really work the way I think the devs wanted it to work. If I had to put this game on a tier list, I'd say it's a solid B. B for Bastion. From the perspective of someone who's played their other titles, Bastion is fascinating. It's like you can see the threads of how this became this, which created this, which ended up as this. You can see the beginnings of a design style that's been iterated upon again and again to make their brand recognizable. But it never just feels like an iteration on something they've already made. Every game they release feels truly distinct from the last. And the next game they released a few years later is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Transistor is incredible. If Bastion is the starter, then Transistor is like the main meal. It has all of the beauty and elegance of Bastion's art style and storytelling decisions, but they've brought the gameplay up to match it. Transistor has a really unique gameplay concept that is just so much better than the sort of generic hack and slash combat featured in Bastion. So Transistor has a turn-based mechanic. No, not like that sort of turn-based. No, the game's not turn-based, alright? The game is a real-time game. But it's like a real-time game mixed in with a turn-based game, you know? So you can move around and use abilities in real time, but if you press space, time stops. You then get to plan out a sort of turn as if it was turn-based. You have a meter at the top of your screen that fills up as you do actions. Anything from moving to dashing to using your attacks will fill the meter. So you plan out the attacks you're gonna do, and then when you end your turn, they all play out quickly in front of you. This is so much more interesting to me than the basic hack and slash combat of Bastion, because with hack and slash combat, it needs to feel incredibly fluid and have tons of weapon variety and stuff to really feel like a fun combat style. But Bastion felt like it lacked the polish, manpower, and budget to really make it feel perfect. So Transistor has gone in an entirely new direction. A direction that's not only more unique, but is also easier to pull off from a game feel standpoint. The gameplay loop of Transistor is so good, it just literally never gets old for me. Because there's just a bunch of enemies in your path and abilities on your loadout, and there's a billion different ways that you could clear out the enemies in front of you. You have so many choices all the time on what to do and how how to do it. And there's no wrong answer. As long as you clear out the enemies in front of you, there just isn't an incorrect way to do that. A small gripe with the gameplay loop that I do have is it's this little like screen here. After every combat encounter, you level up and the game locks you into looking at this little level up meter for a second, and it's kind of annoying after a while. It's a pretty minor nitpick because you can just skip past it really, really fast, but it happens after literally every single enemy encounter. And when it happens, you can't move. So it just makes the pacing of the game feel a little bit slower for basically no actual reason. They could easily make this pop-up like 50% smaller and then allow you to move while it's on screen. But other than that minor nitpick, Transistor's gameplay loop is fantastic. Transistor is not a very long game. The game's only like 3 or 4 hours long, but to me, that's a good thing, because the game is only this short because it never lets anything get stale. It introduces a new enemy or a new ability, shows you it for a little while, but the moment that enemy is feeling a bit boring or repetitive, it cycles it to new enemies that have different abilities and have to be avoided and combated differently. And once the game's used up all of its neat, new, interesting ideas, the game just ends. It doesn't need to pad for runtime. Why would it? It shows a massive amount of maturity in a developer to be able to make a game short in this way. You don't need the game to be long just for the sake of it. You've made the game as long as it needs to be. But if we're talking about the studio's evolution from Bastion, the gameplay isn't the only place to see it. The storytelling is done in a much more subtle way here. The narrator is replaced instead by your sword husband. Your husband, he's in a sword, right? He essentially acts like the narrator from Bastion, but instead of recalling events as if they've already happened, he actually talks in the present tense, because he's actually there. He's experiencing the story at the same time as you are, whereas the narrator in Bastion has already experienced the story and is talking in the past tense. And your player character can't talk. You know, we're going back to like Gordon Freeman style silent protagonists. She's a singer that's lost her voice. She's had her voice stolen, which, if you ask me, is some real good poetic shit. Everyone lives in this simulation, and there's like a government-esque corporation trying to rewrite the simulation using these little creatures called the Process. And some part of their scheme goes wrong, and now the Process is destroying everything. But all of that story is told a lot more environmentally this time around. Because as cool as the narrator in Bastion is, it can feel a little bit heavy-handed at times. Transistor's story is told less through things like exposition dumps. A lot of the details of the story are found in these little incidental text nodes that are baked into the world organically, where you can read a bunch of little snippets that give you a better idea of what life was like before all of this end of the world stuff started happening. So the story and world building is done with these text logs, and with offhanded quotes from the characters, and even from just the visuals themselves. And because the story is centered around this character, Red, the young singer who's lost her voice, a ton of the soundtrack has her singing in it, her songs before she lost her voice. So the soundtrack is directly baked right into the story. Red's voice is sung by the amazing Ashley Barrett. She's sung in every Supergiant game so far, from Bastion all the way to Hades. Most of you watching probably know her as Eurydice from Hades. Supergiant Games has always had crazy music. Every single OST they've made is incredible. But Transistor's soundtrack, to me at least, is the best example of it. They love to ingrain the soundtrack into the story, even if it's just a little bit. And the reason they do this so well is actually very simple. The person who makes the music for Supergiant Games is a full-time employee. His name's Darren Korb. He's the composer of all of the music from all of Supergiant's games. He also performs most of the music himself, and he's responsible for all of the audio design and audio mixing and stuff like that. He works full-time at Supergiant, which is actually incredibly unusual for the industry. Most game studios, including the AAA billion-dollar ones, don't have their musicians and composers as full-time employees, because making music for a game isn't considered full-time work. Making a game can take years and years, but writing and recording the OST isn't expected to take even close to that long. So usually, games OSTs are made by freelance musicians. Maybe they'll use the same freelance musician every time, but they're still freelance. But at Supergiant, their musician is also their audio technician, so he works alongside the devs all year round. So he can have input on the story and the way the music is going to be weaved into it, which is how Transistor's soundtrack became so intrinsically linked to the character that you play as and the story that takes place. And my favourite example of this in any of their games is the Sybil boss fight in Transistor.
Hello again, Sybil.
The fight takes place in an old theatre that your character used to sing in. In phase 1 of her fight, the music is just piano and vocals.
I hear
But as Phase 2 comes around, the instruments become a bit more robotic, with Red's voice being the only thing that still sounds the same. And then in Phase 3, even Red's voice has become corrupted by this strange robotic sound.
Maybe you're looking for someone to blame.
This is just so much more interesting than just generic boss music blaring in the background. It actually feels connected to the story in an interesting way. And the reason it's all done so well is because of Darren Korb. The significance of an in-house musician cannot be understated. Everything in Transistor just feels so much less generic than Bastion. Not to slag off Bastion too much, because I actually did like that game, but it just feels like such a step up from this, and it feels so much more distinct in terms of its aesthetics and its themes. The visuals are absolutely stunning. Transistor's art style is fascinating to me. It's got this like Art Deco sci-fi vibe, and this rosy color palette of blacks, golds, and greens is juxtaposed against the menacing white and red of the process rewriting everything. It feels like a true step up from what was seen before, which is to be expected, I guess. The studio's first ever game isn't expected to be perfection, but the sheer size of just how big of a step this game made from their first game is crazy. Calling it impressive wouldn't be doing it justice. I also love the dedication to immersion here. Transistor has so many little details that serve no practical or gameplay purpose whatsoever. They only exist to make the world feel lived in by the characters. It has a couple of things that I like to call immersion buttons. Transistor's main character is the singer that can no longer sing, so the devs decided to give you a dedicated button on your controller or keyboard just to allow you to do this. You can stop and hum along to whatever song is playing in the background at any given time. You can do this almost anywhere in the entire game, so long as you have control over your character. And I love it. It serves no practical gameplay purpose whatsoever. The only reason it's there is to give your character some personality, because making you feel connected to a character that's a tiny little few pixels on your screen and can't even speak is really difficult. And this is just such an elegant way to do that. There's also a flourish button that makes Red do a little twirl that is basically used for the same purpose. It doesn't do anything, it just looks cool. But just having little buttons do wacky things is not the only way they try and make the world more immersive and lived in. There's a bunch of stuff that you can come across in the game that does this too. You can come across a set of bathroom stalls that Red will go in and use them with this little cutscene. You can go to this little kiosk and order a pizza, and when you arrive at your apartment later in the game, you can eat the pizza that you ordered like an hour ago. You can solemnly look at this advertising poster for one of your old shows, and you can see that poster still up later in the game after the world has become a bit more corrupted. There's even this little sandbox area where you can go to sleep in a hammock and watch the digital sunset. There's no practical purpose to any of this. It's only there to make the characters feel more human and the world feel more real. And it's such a simple yet clever way to achieve this. Now, I'd already played Transistor before making this video, so I replayed it again just to, refresh my memory, and it was a blast. But a second playthrough really feels vastly different, because you sort of already know what all the best strategies are. Like, there is a maximum damage combo at any given time, and because I've played the game a couple times already, I could sort of just run around insta-killing every enemy in the game all the time. Which isn't really a flaw, Like, if a player wants to min-max their damage loadout to deal a bajillion damage to an enemy, then they should be able to do that. But it definitely makes the game feel a little bit easy at times. On a first playthrough, you don't really have this problem, but on subsequent playthroughs, the problem becomes relatively apparent. You can use the stealth function and the load function to basically insta-kill every encounter in the game. Use stealth to summon a packet, instantly use turn the moment it spawns and summon another. Hit both packets to have them both explode for like 700 damage. If you get that one upgrade and attach it to the load, you can place 2 packets in a turn so that you have 3 for even more damage. Later in the game, you can even get this ability called Void, which weakens enemies, allowing you to weaken the enemy before placing 2 packets for even more damage. The damage you can deal is completely crazy, but if you want to do a min-max build of damage like this, then I feel like that's fine for the most part. The only time I feel like it isn't fine is the final boss. The final boss is really, really cool. It's that classic boss fight trope that I really love, which is literally just, I'm you, but stronger. Except he actually isn't that much stronger. Because with this combo, you can literally delete an entire phase of his boss fight before he can do anything about it. He's supposed to be able to use turns and attack you in them just like you can do to him. But if you use your stealth ability, walk up to him, start your turn, void him twice, then place 2 packets and hit them, this will deal 1,000 damage to him and destroy the whole phase instantly. You can just do that, run away and wait for your stealth to come back, and then do it to him again, over and over, until he dies. Everywhere else in this game, being able to nuke stuff for this much damage doesn't really matter. Because there's lots of enemies, but this only really works on small clumps of enemies, so if they're all spread out, you can't insta-kill the whole fight anyway. And you also get the void ability very late into the game, so you can't use it on earlier bosses. But for this final boss fight, it really does trivialize it to the point of ruining the fight. This fight had the potential to be incredibly cool, but instead you can just eviscerate the boss instantly. And you know what they say, don't you? If you give players the ability to optimize the fun out of a game, that's exactly what they're gonna do. I absolutely love this game. It truly feels like a hidden gem. I know I just whinged about it a bit, but you should go play it. It's definitely up in the S tier. S for Transistor. The next game that Supergiant made was even more out there than this one, going into some serious avant-garde territory.
To brave injustice till the stars have gone.
I had never played Pyre before making this video. This game was completely brand new to me. And I'm just gonna lay my cards on the table, just transparency's sake, you know. I don't like this game. I didn't enjoy this game really at all. I don't think there's anything like inherently wrong with it, you know? I see the appeal that it could have to another person, but for me personally, I just don't like it at all. The game is just as visually incredible as the last, and I'm sure the story is just as rich too, but I just really couldn't get into it. See, when you look at the Steam page for this game, it shows this really awesome looking sports style game with 3 players on either team. You know, it's like a fantasy setting basketball or something, and that is in the game. They're called Rights. Rights are like a fantasy, magical, sports game basketball kind of thing, but the overwhelming majority of the time spent in the game is not spent playing magical basketball. It's spent reading. The game is way more visual novel than it is fantasy sports game. Yet if you look at the trailers, you would never really know this. They showed you that there's text in the game. The conversations had by characters are shown, but they by no means make it clear that this is the bulk of the game, which it is. The overwhelming majority of time spent in the game is just reading these pieces of text, which made me tremendously disappointed, because this sports ball part of the game looked really cool and interesting to me, and it actually is really cool and interesting. You control 3 characters all at once, but you can only move one of them at a time. Characters that aren't holding the ball have this ring around them. If enemies touch that ring, they die for a few seconds. You can also shoot waves of energy at each other to kill each other too. Your goal is to grab the ball in the middle of the stage and get it into the enemy's goal, their Pyre, and the enemies are trying to do the same to you. There's a ton of depth to it. All of the different characters with different abilities make for a ton of viable strategies. Demons like Jodariel take up a huge amount of space on the arena, but they're not so good offensively because of how slow they are. Savages are incredibly quick, but they have startup animations on their sprints and jumps and stuff. Imps like Htwo are incredibly fast and can self-destruct, which is a powerful offensive move that puts them out of the fight for a little while. There's a ton of strategies to be made just in choosing which characters you play in your roster. Then there's even more depth on top of that when you level up your characters. Each character in your party gains XP and levels up in a variety of different ways, which can let them get new abilities, like the demons giving your goal more health, or nomads giving your allies the abilities to revive each other, or giving savages the ability to have infinite stamina while holding the ball. This one's completely broken. It's like a really cool sports game with RPG elements, which is a unique gameplay concept that I've never seen anywhere else. The AI can leave a lot to be desired at times, because they do feel really, really dumb. The bot got really confused.
But the actual sports game that you're playing is incredibly fun. But this gameplay loop is drowned in an endless slog of text on your screen all the time. Text that you can just skip past, but you feel inclined not to for obvious reasons. The story is almost exclusively told through this text. Skipping past it means that you will have absolutely no idea what's going on, which might be fine by some people, but the people who want to actually experience the story as well as the sports game, they have to read through a near endless amount of dialogue. And the rights don't even last very long. A single combat encounter probably lasts a maximum of 10 minutes, and 10 minutes is an insanely generous estimate. Yet you spend at least 20 minutes on a good day just reading and clicking and waiting for the next right to start. For when I was actually trying to read and take in the story, there was at least 15 to 20 minutes of reading before and after every single right. And that's not including clicking through menus and then watching the wagon drive slowly across the map, which is unskippable, by the way. There is this neat little feature which highlights certain key text in red, and it lets you hover over it to get a description of it. That definitely shortened some of the dialogue. Without this feature, characters would literally have to explain every tiny little detail all the time, and it would be even worse than it already is. But even with this feature, the sheer amount of downtime there is completely overshadows what could be a good game lying beneath it all. You spend such an unreasonable amount of time reading what characters say, watching a wagon roll around in the overworld map, clicking through menus to make decisions and give your characters buffs and stuff. It's like reading a book where every time 2 sentences appear on a page, you have to turn the page. Every time the speaker changes, you turn the page. Every time there's a new area, you turn the page. It's just mind-numbing after a while. Now, I know what you're thinking, but what about Hades? Hades has a visual novel aspect, and that game's critically acclaimed. Why is that one fine, but this one isn't? Well, there's a few reasons. A big part of why Hades works and this game doesn't is the voice acting.
Look what I got for you, boy.
There's tons of reading in Hades, but it's all voice acted. Pyre does have, like, kind of voice acting, but it's not the lines actually being read out to you. It's little Hollow Knight style gibberish every time text appears on screen. The voice acting in Hades does a ton of heavy lifting to make the sheer amount of text in the game bearable. But arguably far more importantly than that is that the text in Hades is almost entirely optional. Characters get little exclamation marks over their heads when they have new dialogue, but if you really don't give a shit what they have to say, you just don't have to talk to them. There's some mandatory dialogue, but very little. So if you well and truly didn't care about the dialogue in Hades, most of it isn't mandatory, and the parts that are, you can just spam click past in a half a second. And most importantly of all, is that even if you do enjoy the visual novel side of Hades just as much as the roguelike side of it, you would spend about half of your time reading the visual novel stuff and half of your time playing the roguelike. But Pyre isn't like that at all. Even if you love Pyre's visual novel, if you're engaging with it fully, you're spending upwards of 90% of the entire game's runtime just reading it. Which, if you love visual novels, I'm sure that sounds like a blast. But for me, that's just an enormous turn-off. I'm just not interested. So much of the time spent in the game has nothing to do with what makes the game so unique. The actual sports-like arena game where you're trying to dunk on the enemies Michael Jordan style, that's why I want to play the game. There are literally thousands of visual novels on Steam, but how many fantasy RPG sports games have you heard of? None. Now, I don't actually know this part for sure, but if I had to hazard a guess, I would assume that Supergiant Games wanted to tell a bigger story than they'd ever told before. They wanted this huge story with intertwining paths about characters trying to escape from limbo, but they just didn't have the gargantuan budget required to truly pull that off in the way that maybe they wanted to. They couldn't afford to hire the voice actors to go through the insane amounts of dialogue, and they couldn't afford the animators to make things into cutscenes or whatever. So when they went to make Hades, they tried to make a story just as big, but they learned from this and tried to make it in a much different way. And limitation certainly does breed innovation. They've made a game that's incredibly unique in their attempts to try and make this enormous story, but I just couldn't get through it. About a quarter of the way through the game, I just started spam clicking all the text. Then I learned that there's a little setting that you can turn on that literally just lets you hold spacebar and skip the text that way, so I started doing that. But even while doing this, it's still time consuming to have the text pop up on your screen and then go away in 2 seconds. Like, you can't completely skip it, it still comes up on your screen, even if it's not for very long, because 95% of the text in Pyre is mandatory, as opposed to Hades, where 95% of it isn't. Combine all of this with all of the RPG element menuing and stuff, and it just feels like you're not playing a game at all, you're just doing chores. And I actually didn't finish Pyre in the end. I think I got about halfway through it, maybe, you know, a little more than that. I managed to liberate 2 of my party members, and then I gave up. And the thing is, I don't even really know what happened in the story, because I just didn't have the willpower to read it all. Which is a damn shame, because from what I did read, it seemed like a really interesting concept. It was just presented in such a mind-numbing way that I couldn't engage with it. Which is a really big shock to me, by the way. After playing a game like Transistor, where the story is told in such a clever and nuanced way that doesn't feel condescending, playing Pyre immediately after that was like a slap in the face. I guess that increasing the size and scope of the story tenfold in the way that they did made it much more difficult to keep that storytelling style intact. But my experience with Pyre was mostly a negative one. There were some things I liked. I enjoyed the way the liberation thing worked, because the story is all about you and your party members living in purgatory, and the rites are the way of earning your way back to the real world or whatever. But you can only liberate your strongest party members, so you have to choose very carefully who you're going to get rid of, because if you get rid of them, they're gone for good. So you can't just chuck away the weak characters that you never use, you actually have to try and incorporate everyone into the game as much as possible. Otherwise you're going to start losing your strongest party members, and eventually you're not going to be able to play the game. But I had a relatively bad experience with the game as a whole. It just really didn't feel like it was for me, and it felt like the parts of all the trailers that I found interesting only made up a very tiny percentage of the game's actual playtime. I'll put Pyre in C. C for can't play this game because I can't read. Look, it's the one you've all heard of. We finally got to it. Hades is a much, much longer game than anything else they've made up to this point. It's a roguelite mixed in with a visual novel, a combination that sounds like it would never work, but is actually really compelling. Pyre was their first attempt at making a long and complex story in one of their games, but Hades was where they actually mastered this. Whereas in Pyre, the text and story feels like a slog to get through, in Hades you actually want to read what the character has to say. Every line of dialogue is voice acted, which makes it much more engaging and makes it easier to sympathize with the characters. It gives them more personality. And most of the dialogue, thank the Lord, is optional. So if you feel like you've done too much reading for now, you can just walk past the character without engaging with them. And if you're not into the visual novel aspect at all, then there's a whole ass roguelike game to go play. The hack and slash combat from Bastion is back, but this time it feels so much more responsive and fluid. You can really tell that the developers have learned from their past experiences in making a combat system like this. Everything is significantly quicker. You can cancel pretty much any attack into a dash. So you can animation cancel all of your attacks that have long end lag to get back to moving faster, which was actually a big part of what made Bastion's combat feel so sluggish. Whenever you'd attack or fire a weapon, your character would stop moving, which also does happen a lot in Hades too. But in Bastion, there's nothing you can do to cancel out of this animation. Your character just can't move or do anything else until the animation ends. Hades lets you cancel pretty much any attack into any other attack, or into a dash, so you can fly around the stage really fluidly the entire time, which makes it feel faster and also more skill expressive. There's only 6 weapons to choose from, but each of those weapons has 4 variations called weapon aspects that make the weapon's control completely differently. Some of those aspects are good for raw damage, some of those aspects make your casts extremely strong, some of them synergize with certain boons from certain gods, and some of them are completely broken. And it's also a roguelike game, meaning that each and every run is randomized, at least to some extent, which means that the game just inherently has 10 times more replay value than any other single player game will ever have, because each and every run will be different from the last in some way. The way items work in Hades is a little bit different from other roguelikes, and I think it's great. Items are called boons. They're essentially just like buffs and upgrades that you can find along your path, but these boons are given to you by certain unlike, gods from Olympus, which means that you can influence your build based on who you choose to take boons from. Zeus's boons are good for high attack speed weapons. Dionysus has AoE and damage over time boons. Artemis has crit chance boons, and Athena has boons that are mostly defensive oriented. This means that when you clear a room and you see these doors that give you a choice of what reward to take, you can make decisions based on which gods you want to take boons from. If your build could really use more mobility, then you take the door for Hermes, or if you really need that one Zeus boon that makes your build just completely pop off, then you try and find it and take it. It's still random, but it lets you at least slightly know what to expect, and it gives you a greater level of control over that randomness. And this is what makes all of the best roguelikes so good, in my opinion at least. The ability to make lots of smart strategic decisions about your items and resources that allow you to rig your runs and turn weak runs into powerful ones. That's what makes all of the best roguelikes so good, at least if you ask me. And Hades does that in a handful of ways. It gives you control over your builds with stuff like the item shop and the ability to see what rewards come in the next room, and the way that boons give you a choice of 3 separate upgrades you can take, and you know what to expect from each god's boon options. Sometimes you can even reroll your boons. It gives you decisions that can make or break your run, and that is what roguelikes are all about. Although the amount of randomness in Hades is actually a lot smaller than your average roguelike. Most roguelikes give you way more variation of room layouts and enemies and stuff, and most roguelikes have random boss encounters too, whereas Hades has the same 4 bosses every single time. The Pact of Punishment lets you change up the bosses slightly, but it's basically the same boss. And speaking of the Pact of Punishment, this is another great source of replay value. You can add a bunch of difficulty modifiers that make the game way harder in exchange for more rewards. It's similar to the idols in Bastion we talked about, and there's examples of this in Pyre and Transistor too. But in Hades, they've added way more options to make the game harder, which is yet another thing that makes the game way more replayable than any of the other titles are. Add on top of that a story that takes like literally 50 hours to get to the ending of, and a dialogue system that will still be giving you new dialogue options literally thousands of hours into playing the game, and you've got a recipe for Supergiant's biggest game yet. And their biggest game in terms of scope has also been their biggest game in terms of success too. Hades is significantly more popular than their next most popular game, by a very large margin. Finding accurate sales numbers of games is pretty much completely impossible, but the next best thing we can use is Steam reviews. The number of Steam reviews that have been left on a game is a semi-accurate way to measure the overall popularity of the game. More Steam reviews left means more players playing the game. Bastion has 35,000 Steam reviews. Transistor is close behind with 29,000. Pyre's quite a long way behind with 8,000 Steam reviews. But Hades has 221,000 Steam reviews. 221,000. If you use this as the only metric, that's more than 5 times more popular than Bastion. Now, reading this is of course not a foolproof plan, because these games also sold on console. But apparently, Hades has also sold incredibly well on consoles, perhaps even better than on PC. So including console sales might actually make this gap even bigger. Point being, Hades has skyrocketed Supergiant Games from being a semi-niche developer that had a cult following to being one of the biggest names in the indie scene. You could say that they're Supergiant. In fact, Hades is so successful that it's actually getting a sequel. Hades 2 was announced in December of 2022, and it will be the first sequel that the studio has ever made. And with numbers like these, I just can't say I blame them. And hopefully the sequel will be even bigger and even better than the original. I can't say much about Hades 2, obviously, but you want to know the one thing that I can say for certain about it? It's that Hades 2, without a shadow of a doubt, is going to have this guy in it. This is Logan Cunningham, and he is the voice of many a character in Supergiant's back catalogue. He's the narrator in Bastion.
And then he falls to his death. I'm just fooling.
He's also the narrator in Pyre too. Raider. He's also the sword husband in Transistor.
Hello again, Sybil.
And in Hades, he's like basically everyone. He is Poseidon, Hades, Charon, Achilles, Asterius, and the narrator. He's like half the named characters in the whole game. And the reason he's so prominent in their games is simple. It's because he's a full-time employee of the company. Just like Darren Korb, who's Supergiant's musician that we talked about earlier. Usually, voice actors and musicians and the like are freelancers. They don't don't work with the game studios full-time because companies don't see them as being valuable for full-time roles. But having your talented voice actor be a full-time member of your team is extremely valuable. It's impossible to overstate how big of a deal it is to closely work with your voice acting talent like this. Because when you write your characters, you can write them so closely based on the individual who's going to be voicing them, with the person giving that voice being able to directly give feedback to make the character as perfectly portrayed as possible. It might not seem like a big deal to you, but it makes a world of difference, especially when you start out as a small indie company just working out of your apartment to make a game that you think might be cool. And the voice acting itself is a huge part of why the long visual novel gameplay actually feels fun in Hades, whereas in Pyre, the visual novel aspect doesn't feel so great. Hades is actually not a roguelike. It's what people instead call a roguelite. A roguelike is where each individual run is contained. You start out every run from scratch, and nothing carries over from one run to the next. The only decisions you can make outside a run are what characters and loadouts to use. Hades is a roguelite, which means that there are some upgrades and leveling systems outside of the run that you can use to make yourself stronger. But then the actual run itself functions basically the same as every other roguelike. In Hades, you have the Mirror of Night. It's basically a little upgrade station that lets you make yourself stronger. But this has a bit of a strange side effect, because it means that the very first time you load up the game is very difficult, but the game rapidly gets easier as you purchase mirror upgrades, and then the game gets progressively harder like you'd expect of any other normal game. The enemies are just as tough in the first 5 minutes as they're going to be 50 hours in, but your character is objectively weaker at the start of the game because you don't have any mirror upgrades. I'm not personally a big fan of this. I've always preferred more traditional roguelikes over this style of design choice, because it feels like I'm being artificially gated out of winning my first run for basically no reason. The mirror is a pretty good mechanic. Like, it gives you a bunch of upgrades, but you can't use them all at once, so you have to make decisions on which of them to run. Like, do you want 3 lives, or do you want 1 weaker life that replenishes every time you clear a room? Do you want to re-roll room rewards, or re-roll the God's Boon choices? Do you want more damage on backstabs, or more damage on your first hit to an enemy? You can tailor these upgrades based on what sort of build you want to go with for whichever weapon you're going to use. But the fact that you have to collect an in-game currency to unlock these upgrades as time goes on means that you're super weak at the start of the game and rapidly become stronger. Starting the game out with all of these options enabled would probably be pretty overwhelming for a new player, but maybe having them somehow be chosen at the start of a run, or like incorporating them into during the run, maybe that would be better. I don't know, I'm not a game designer, am I? Listen, there's nothing really wrong with it working the way it does. It's just a personal preference thing, and I personally enjoy the entire run being a contained thing much more than having external upgrades affect how powerful I am. Hades is a fantastic video game. You can really tell that every game they've made up until this moment has built up to them creating their most polished and well-crafted game yet. It's an incredible video game that deserves basically all of the hype it gets. On the tier list, I give it an A. A for, this game's pretty good. I don't fucking know. Supergiant's catalogue only has 4 games, but it spans more than a decade, and I just love how you can see the progression from one thing to the next as the studio gets more mature as time goes on. You can really see their experience level increasing over time, where their games became more polished and stood out more from the crowd as they kept making things. I honestly implore you all to go play these games if you already haven't, because they're all really good. You know, maybe I disliked Pyre, but I can also see the appeal of it if you're the right type of person. If you're super into visual novels, then you'll probably like it way more than I did, and I can't wait to see what Hades 2 has in store. Every single release Supergiant has made so far has made a game that's completely different from the last, but with this one being a sequel, it's hard to tell whether that's going to be the case or not. Personally, I hope it tries to change things up, but whether it will, only time will tell. Thanks for watching.